Hello, I'm Cynthia Rogers from the University of Oklahoma. So I have my red on, my Sooner Crimson. Thanks. So when I got called and asked to come, I thought, wow, this is great because finally somebody wants to know about what I've been researching for the last 15 years. Usually my kids ask me what I'm doing and they're like, oh, Mom, that's boring. So, but then I was told I had 10 minutes, so that's not so good for me. We'll see how it goes. Which button do I press? Okay. So the million-dollar question here is, does tax policy affect economic growth? And what I'm going to talk about is not particularly the Laffer analysis, but the state of the research. And what we know from all the economic studies that you can pile up. Now, I can't say that I've read all of them, but I've read lots of them, 15 years worth. And again, I only have 10 minutes, so you're just going to get the summary of what we can take away from the economics research. These are my 3 main points that I'd like to hammer into you today. The research is inconclusive about how tax policy is related to economic growth. And this isn't just the Laffer curve, but this is just the academic research as well. Even the most rigorous research is inconclusive and doesn't offer much insight for particular tax cuts in particular states. The plan for Oklahoma is not supported by the research, mostly because there's really no precedent of a state eliminating a source of 30% of its state and local tax revenues. So therefore, we have nothing to research to give insight to the question. And also, there's just a lot of unspecified details about what happens on the spending side. How does it change the mix of taxes change throughout the state? So that's really what I'm going to talk about, the details of these 3 points for the next, whatever, 9.5 minutes that I have left. One of the big problems in the empirical research is how to measure tax policy. So we have these complicated tax systems across a bunch of different states. You have complicated tax changes, and we're social scientists. We don't work in a vacuum. There's never just one change. Lots of things change. So one of the problems is the measure that's typically used, the tax burden measure, some measure of tax revenue divided by personal income, gross state product, population, whatever. The problem with this measure is it changes without having tax policy changes. If you're interested, I have a paper on this. You can go read all the gory details. But you can just imagine, revenues personal income goes up in the state for some non-tax reason, and what happens? It looks like your tax burden fell. So if you put it in a regression, or maybe you put personal income on one side and you have personal income on the other side, and you look at the relationship, it's no wonder that you would find these things related, whether there's a tax policy change or not. And the question at hand is, what's going to happen with the tax policy change in Oklahoma? So using measures like this, even if you're looking at lots of data in lots of states, it doesn't tell you much about a tax policy change in particular. You have the same problem with other sorts of measures that you could use, marginal tax rate, average tax rate, and I have papers on those sorts of things too. There's also lots of factors that matter, and Dr. Wilner told us nicely his stories about these. And this is like the human factor. These are subjective choices, what time frames you pick, and what measures of economic performance you might care about. So you could take the same states that were in the Laffer analysis, you could look at a different time frame, you could look at different measures, and you get the story that the high income tax states outperform the no income tax states. So this is not my analysis, this is from ITEP. You have the link to where to find that. So the measures matter. We don't really have robust results to tell us, oh yes, do this and we get growth. Another fundamental problem with the research, and this is all research, the Laffer, the academic research, almost every paper I've seen, and remember, I've read hundreds and hundreds of these things, so I have all the gray hair, is usually when you see a tax policy change, that's linked to what's already happening in the economy. You raise taxes when you need the money to pay for stuff. You lower taxes when things are going well. Hence, what's happening in the economy is driving the tax policy change. But then you want to look at, they're going to be related, they'll be statistically related. You can find a statistical correlation and a regression analysis, whatever fancy stuff you want to do. But that's not telling you that the tax policy change, how that affected the growth measure you're interested in. So I thought, oh, well, I should have a good example of this. And my example was overweight people go on diets. So you would see that people on diets, people that are overweight, go on diets. You would see a statistical relationship between being on a diet and being overweight, but that doesn't mean going on the diet caused you to be overweight. Now, it may or may not have contributed to your weight, but it was the underlying factor that caused the policy change. It turns out this is a fundamentally difficult, this is a really hard problem to look at in an empirical sense. I don't care what fancy models you have. We have a fancy name for it in economics. Come to my class, I'll tell you, this is policy endogeneity. But what it means is if you stack up all these studies end to end, you get to the moon and you don't get a conclusion. It's the typical economist's response. But there's a good reason, because these are very complicated things. So that's the dismal answer that, oh, the research doesn't really tell you anything about the links between tax policy and economic growth. So how might we think about making the connection for Oklahoma in this particular case? And a way to think about this is, well, there's going to be a change in the income tax structure. That's going to affect people's after-tax income. That's going to affect how much they spend in the state. And that's going to affect demand. And businesses will respond to demand by hiring more people, paying more wages, all the good stuff we're looking for. Well, okay, so how does that work? Well, this is a prediction. This is not my prediction. This is a prediction, some analysis of what the tax, lowering the top tax rate in the state would look like if this was funded by reducing exemptions and credits in the tax code. So what we see is there's going to be some shifting. This was done by ITEP. Again, you have the link to this study at the OK Policy website. 60% of the households would actually incur an increase in their tax obligation. 40% a decrease, with the top 1% getting a major decrease. So that's that big dip there. So if you want to know, is this going to have a spending stimulus in the state, well, you have to look at how much of this change in income would play out into demand. And so I did a really back of the envelope kind of thing. Said, well, how much do people spend of an extra dollar of income they have? Well, I thought if I just Googled this, I'd come up with a very good answer, and I didn't. I came up with answers from 75 cents to 99 cents. So I said, well, let's just pick 95. If we assume that all income groups have the same, the extra dollar, they're going to spend 95 cents of it in the local economy, and we use the weights from the last graph I showed you, we'd actually come out with a reduction of overall spending in the state economy. That's not a stimulus. That's not a demand-driven stimulus. And if you can read lots about the federal stimulus and what that did or didn't do for the federal economy. Now, if you think that different income groups have different likelihood or propensities to spend, particularly in the local economy, then this picture would look very different. These are the details, unfortunately, I don't have for you, but these would be the details we need to know if you're going to argue that an income tax is going to lead to more spending in the state. If you think that wealthy people maybe travel more, they save more, they invest more, they spend it out of the local economy, then the negative number I have up here would be a lot bigger. It's actually a reduction in spending in the state. There's other things that aren't in the policy proposals and that aren't in the discussions that are very important. And that is what's going to happen for expenditures. The research does tell us, and there's very reliable research, that if you fund tax cuts by reducing spending on necessary infrastructure like roads, bridges, education, then you're going to experience negative growth because businesses need those things to operate. They need a trained workforce, educated workforce, and they need roads, and they need bridges, and they need airports. You need to spend on those things if you want to attract businesses. There would also be less available for, say, rainy day funds, which I think we all agree came in handy through this last recession we experienced. And finally, economic growth is not costless. So it's really difficult to hear that we're going to grow, but we're going to spend less. Think about your house. You fill it up with kids. You spend more, you don't spend less. And it's the same with an economy. If you have more people commuting to work, you need to provide for the roads, you need to provide more education, educate more children, more public safety. Growth costs money. New York spends more than Oklahoma City. New York is bigger, so it must. So you really can't look at the bottom line of what you're spending. There's also important implications that haven't been discussed for local governments. Did I miss my cue? Okay, this is good. And that is, local governments find ways to spend money on things that their constituents want. We've seen this happen in California after the Prop 13 tax revolt. We've seen it happen in Tabor, in Colorado, that's been repealed and people are crying. And local governments in the state of Oklahoma have ways to get money for stuff they want. Sales tax is a primary way. I've done some recent research, that's not published yet, but 78% of the initiatives I looked at in a 10-year period were passed, sales tax initiatives. So what would you expect? Local governments are gonna make up lost revenues from the state by raising your taxes. We're going to be shifting taxes from the state level to the local level. Property taxes, there'll be pressure to raise those. Fees. Local governments will find ways to spend money that people want spent locally. So what we see is there's going to be an overall change, a fundamental shift in the tax mix in the state. This will have consequences for equity and stability, I haven't had a chance to talk to you about, and impact for competitiveness. So I'll flash up a couple graphs here. We know our sales taxes are high. So Oklahoma's a dark blue, meaning we have really high sales taxes relative to the rest of the country. There's going to be pressure to make them higher. This graph shows you sort of property taxes. Our property taxes are low, so we'll become less competitive that way. So the devil is in the details on this policy projection. Research is inconclusive. This is a major shift. It will be a major shift in how we fund or don't fund revenue in the state. And we don't have reliable predictions about what will happen in Oklahoma. I want to finish with my extended metaphor on the weight. If you just focus on tax revenues, that's just not enough. We can end up being a 98-pound weakling because we just starve ourselves. Well, I think what everybody will agree is we want a strong, healthy economy, which means you have to worry about building muscle. Fortunately, there's very good research on programs that are effective and can be implemented at the state level that make the economy stronger and prepare the economy for future growth. These would be pre-K, training for workforce, high school academies. So there's a list of particular programs that have been effective. The last two slides I'm not going to talk about. You can mull over them. This one has some details. What investments are we making? Are we investing wisely? And for your light bedtime reading, there's some sources for you.
Well, it is a big crowd out there. I'm Kent Olson. I used to teach economics at Oklahoma State University. I see they sandwiched me between two OU professors. But to tell you the truth, and Lex probably wouldn't tell you this himself, but we've worked together for, gosh, Lex, I think it's almost 35 years. And it's, oh no, look at your hair. And I'm not telling you the truth about mine. But it's been a very pleasant association, and I'm delighted to be sharing the stage with my colleagues from other institutions. My first time with anybody from Oklahoma City University. There are a number of OSU people out there, and we may outnumber you in some respects. What I'm going to do today is exercise the privilege of being retired and not having to worry about tenure. And that is to make some 20-year predictions about what would happen if the Laffer-based tax cut proposal were to make its way all through the legislature and be signed by the governor. I say this because economists, academic economists in any event, are not usually in the business of making long-run projections, but it's an enjoyable thing to do. What drives me here is I'm particularly disturbed by what I call back-loaded tax cuts. Those are tax cuts, the major revenue impact from which occurs in the future. So we can look at what is a big tax cut now, if it were to occur, as something on the neighborhood of, by the time it were phased out, close to $3 billion. But if you extend it for even 10 more years, you're looking at a $5 billion impact. And I'm going to show you that. You're going to run that show over there, David? Thank you. This deserves no discussion, but for those of you who are interested in what I did to make the projections, this summarizes them. The deficit is already almost $350 million. And by the time you get through the end of the projection period, which is just 20 years down the road, it's about $2.6 billion. Now, this assumes the continuation of current policies, both with respect to taxes and expenditures. And what's really driving this are the factors that drive taxes. For example, personal income drives the personal income tax, and the factors that drive expenditures, and I've only considered two, and that's population changes and price changes or cost changes. So this is the way we are, and if we don't change anything else, just giving things that are normally going to be occurring, this is what we're looking at 20 years down the road. Pretty frightening, I think. You can sum it up, it's pretty simple. There's just a small gap between the rate at which I project taxes will grow and the rate at which expenditures will grow. As a matter of fact, it amounts to only 0.75% per year differential. And you run that out for 20 years and you get this kind of picture. So you don't have to be talking major differences. As long as the growth rates differ, you're going to get a divergence that looks something like this. Next slide. Okay. Now, why? How come we're in this position? Well, the principal reason, as I see it, is the tax cuts, the income tax cuts in particular, which were passed in the time frame from 2004 to 2012. And I just made a simple calculation. I think a more sophisticated calculation would give bigger numbers than this. But I estimate that right now, without those tax cuts, which have already occurred, we would not have a deficit, we would have a surplus. But the difference between where we would be without those tax cuts and where we are is something on the neighborhood of $672 million. Now, I haven't included what also occurred during that last decade. The inheritance tax or estate or inheritance tax was eliminated. That's probably a $70 to $100 million a year hit. There were significant changes in the way in which we collect motor vehicle fees, which is also a big hit. You'd find that out by reading Doffenbach and Warner's paper, by the way. So where we would be at the end of this projection period, starting in 2022, even without the income tax cuts which occurred during the last decade, we'd start to run a deficit. But it's not nearly as big. And the difference, one of us, just flash back quickly to that, David. If you look at the without, the red line, and compare it to the blue, I figure that about $1.6 million out of the $1.6 billion out of the $2.6 billion is attributed to those tax cuts. That's what I mean by back-loaded tax cuts. We didn't, I don't think, know what kind of a hole we were digging, hence the title, when we did that, because we're not used to doing that. I would make a plea that we do it for any major policy change that is contemplated. Okay, I'm ready for the next one. So let's look at the worst of all possible cases. That is that the so-called Laffer-based proposal is adopted and signed by the legislature. What's the tax hit? Well, if you think the tax hit's pretty moderate, today, you have to look out 20 years and see where you placed yourself. And that's in a pretty significant hole. That's hence digging a hole deeper. By the end of this projection period, the reduction in income taxes, I figure it'd be close to $5 billion a year. So that's not a total. Those are annual reductions in income taxes. That's not surprising. By the time we get to that point in time, the state's appropriations budget is going to be about $15 billion. And the income tax disappears, and it's a 1/3 reduction in the state's budget. Okay. I just put all three together here. The top line is where we would be if we had not done what we did from 2004 to 2012. Remember, a lot of that was driven, especially in the early period, by this optimistic report or series of reports about what happened to gross production taxes, as if it were going to continue. I really hope we're getting smarter than that. The middle one is what the income tax phase out did to us. Excuse me, the income tax decreases in the 2004-2012 period did to us. And then the final line is where we would be if we were to adopt that Laffer tax cut proposal or Laffer type tax cut proposal. I can't tell you where we'd be if we did a more moderate cut in the income taxes. But I would argue with you that we shouldn't do it to begin with. Anyway, the bottom line, if you want to flash back, just 1 second, David. A deficit in the state's appropriations budget of about $7.5 billion. I love these numbers. They do get your attention. But I think they're pretty conservative, and if any of you want to visit with me about that, I'll explain why, but in 12 minutes, or 10 maybe. We can't discuss that very much. Okay, what does that mean for spending? You recall that the Laffer proposal is to finance the tax cuts with expenditure cuts of equal size, presumably. Well, you would have to, if we did not do the income tax phase out. We're looking at an expenditure cut of about 16% by the end of this time period. And I've done a couple of sensitivity analysis, and I could put that number as high as 22%, which is pretty frightening in and of itself. Okay, thank you. But if we were to adopt the Laffer proposal, it would be 46%. Now, the last slide. I'm not going to try and explain that. You can look at it. But look at the last column. That's the spending cut that would be needed on a year-by-year basis in order to finance the income tax phase out under current circumstances. You get down to 46% at the end. In your spare time, you know, when you're trying to fall asleep at night, just start comparing that 46% to what is spent on some of the principal functions of Oklahoma state government. If you can find a way in there to preserve so-called core functions of government, I'd like to know about it, because there isn't hardly anything that wouldn't take a major hit. And you can dream all day, and you can discover all kinds of things that you could get rid of. Thanks very much.
Chairman of the Economics Department at OU, and I spent 4 years as Governor Bellman's Secretary of Finance and Revenue. That's the actual title that you had. And I got a plaque so I can remember mine. And I was a state budget director. I want to thank David very much for putting this on, and his depthless energy in doing really solid public policy research for the state of Oklahoma is appreciated. I was about to tell you that wasn't on my clock. Asking a professor to speak for 10 minutes is something like me asking my dog not to bark at a mailman. But I'll do what I best can here. we've had wonderful presentations. I'm proud to be a professor with these that go before me. We've got all kinds of technical stuff, and Kent's got things up here. By the way, in footnote 9, the LN stands for logarithm, in case you're interested. We have all manner of regressions and correlations and endogenous ultra-variables come from policy and stuff like that. But let's just put it in the simplest, most straightforward terms as to what this nonsense proposal is purporting to do. Okay? Okay? Here's how it's supposed to work. Okay? Here's how it's supposed to work. Okay? What we're going to do here is we're going to reduce the income tax, make it 0, and that's going to induce a new job to show up. Now let's imagine a new job does show up because the income tax is now 0. And let's imagine that that job pays $50,000. Now, because that person is not going to pay the income tax, that means the Treasury is now out $2,500, using 5% because I can do those in my head. Okay? Now, this is supposed to be revenue neutral, which means that we're going to make up in sales taxes, by and large, the revenue lost from the income tax. Now, it's an easy mathematical calculation to figure out how much money they would have to spend on sales taxable items to generate $2,500. Now, let's keep the math real simple. Okay? Let's say that the sales tax is 5%. And let's imagine that 100% of everything you spend is sales taxable, which of course it's not. A third of what you spend is on housing, and it's not sales taxable. But let's imagine that's true. So how did I do the math? I took $50,000 and I multiplied it times 0.05, and I got $2,500 in income tax. Guess what I have to do to figure out how to make up $2,500? Divide by 0.05. The person would have to spend every single nickel of their money in order to make up for the deficiency in the income tax. That's how it's supposed to work. Oh, but I forgot something. It's the person who's sitting here right now today. Let's say I'm earning $50,000 and I don't have $2,500 in income taxes. Well, there's two ways to posit this one. If I spent all of that money on sales taxable items, how much money would that generate for the Treasury? Answer, about $120. Well, economic growth, economic development. My income could go up. How much would my income have to go up in order to make up the deficiency in the state Treasury? Answer, $50,000. It can't work. The math is so obviously insane. It can't work. Okay? Now, here's my takeaway from this thing. I wrote it down. See, I got it. Okay? Okay? The scariest part of this is if it doesn't work, you can't fix it. That just keeps me up at night, okay? If this thing goes all pear-shaped, you can't fix it, okay? My old boss used to say when the legislature would send down some piece of work, and he'd say, well, they didn't get it right, send it back up to them. And I said, well, they passed it. And they said, in 2 hours they can pass another bill. They can fix it. This you can't fix. This you can't fix. There seems to be no understanding of the constraints that are built into the system. Nobody over there is reading the state constitution. For all these constitutional lovers of our fathers, okay? Nobody's reading our state constitution, okay? Our state constitution says that if you want to have a tax increase, you've got to have a supermajority in both houses. And I'm here to guarantee you that's never going to happen. That is never going to happen. So if you undo a tax, you can't redo it again. Okay? State question 640. Okay? If you're looking at the burden, and Dr. Rogers has already said, look out cities, here it comes, okay? Property taxes, okay? It's in the Constitution. The Constitution millage levy for property taxes has not been raised since 1974, okay? That's the last time the millage levy, and no one's even proposed raising it since then, except the guys in the ag department who wanted some kind of ag extension property tax deal, and that didn't go. But in any case, okay, what you have then is the constraints in the system on the property tax makes that impossible. The constraints in the system on tax increases makes that impossible. How did we get into this situation? People ask me, how come Texas gets away with this? Well, first of all, they haven't gotten away with it. They've got a massive budget deficit this year, and they do different mix of taxes. Dr. Rogers has also mentioned the fact that there's a kind of a history to this. One reason we have no property taxes essentially in Oklahoma is because, God, we hate the property tax, okay? And it's born of the era of the Dust Bowl. If you want to read a really, really great book, by the way, The Worst Bad Times, good reading, okay? It tells you something about who we are and where we came from, and it reminds us why we have this hate, the hate of jail when it comes to what it is that we do when it comes to the property taxes, okay? So in that context there's our property taxes, okay? What does that do? It creates a system where the cities in Oklahoma don't have access to the property taxes. Cities everywhere else do. The Treasury of Texas is relieved of two burdens, cities and school districts. The school districts in Oklahoma rely on the state treasury because they can't get local property taxes, okay? The cities in Oklahoma compete with the state treasury because they can't get property taxes, and therefore we have these very high sales tax rates here, but it's not all going to the state treasury. It's going to split state and city treasury. If you want to really have some fun reading, read the Tax Commission report on the sales tax rates. Some of our little tiny towns around here are taxing themselves absolutely to death on the sales taxes. Cindy, what's the highest? 18% or something like that? 12. Unbelievable, okay? And by the way, in about 1976, about 78, counties were allowed access to the sales tax. So we have 3 jurisdictions all on the sales tax, which, by the way, also taxes groceries. No one's really spoken to the equity questions here, okay? You will never get rid of the sales tax on groceries under this kind of circumstance. It will never happen. Probably never happen anyway. The city council league will never let it allow it. Okay, but anyway, it's never going to happen. So we have an equity question here. You're putting it on consumption, but you're putting it on consumption which includes groceries in Oklahoma, which is very unusual relative to other states. Okay? So that what you have here is this blindness to the degrees of freedom that you have in your choices if you make this choice. If you break it, you can't fix it. And that is the bottom line. I will cede the extra 2 minutes I have to my colleagues here.